Hello, Blogging Heads Nation, and welcome to your special end of the year. What, me worry? Drezburt. I'm Heather Hurlburt. I run the New Models of Policy Change Initiative at New America. I'm a columnist at the Daily Intelligencer at New York Magazine. And what the heck, America?
I'm Daniel Drezner. I have a lot of affiliations that I'm sure would impress you, but really, who cares at this point? Does it matter? Yeah, I teach at the Fletcher School. Yeah, I write for the Washington Post. Does anything really matter now? Because we're in that kind of mode. So, Heather, we should preface by saying I believe that we arranged for this year-end wrap-up earlier in the week, and nothing has happened in the interim, so we don't have to worry. It's been really calm and smooth sailing.
Yeah. It's really, this week has given me a lot of time to reflect in a serene way about sort of all the lessons that we learned from 2018. And, as Blake Hounsell said on Twitter the other day, 2018 was really about the people we met along the way.
And we met quite a few people along the way. I'm sorry.
Only to say goodbye to them again in record short amounts of time. Like, who could believe that in this same calendar year, Tillerson was our Secretary of State? Remember him?
No, actually, this is this has been talked about before, and I don't know if you have this experience, but truthfully, my ability to remember events prior to 96 hours ago, hell, 48 hours ago, has sharply deteriorated during the Trump administration. And yeah, asking me to remember something like way back in 2018, in January or February, I believe I went to the Munich Security Forum this year, but I don't remember what happened. And I don't remember if anything important happened, frankly.
Oh, that's a good point. I went to India in January, or was it February? And Nadia Shadlow was still Deputy National Security Advisor. And she's to be fair, at the end of the year, Nadia published an article in Texas National Security Review where she's still presenting the president as a conservative realist. So,
I'm sorry, I can't take any of this seriously anymore. I apologize. Keep going. I can't. I'm sorry. How the hell are we supposed to take the national security strategy seriously in the wake of Jim Mattis's resignation, and in no small part due to a resignation letter in which he articulated the beliefs, I believe, of the national security strategy, and then saying you need to find someone who agrees with you more than apparently you agree with your own national security strategy.
So I want to pause and two things about that letter that were really remarkable. And, I said this in a column that I somehow wrote last night in between my kid having freakouts about slavery in the U.S. Constitution. And I got to tell you, working on both of those things at once, that was really a deep level of existential despair. But you know how I think many of us have had this experience where there's a person or entity that we're just dying to write a letter to where we tell them what we really think of them. And maybe in a kind of unhealthy way, you go around for weeks or even months, and in a corner of your brain, you have that letter written. And every now and then you kind of come across a phrase. Am I the only person who's obsessive and weird enough that I would write letters? No, I'm not.
No. This is how bad you are. I write drafts of those letters. I never send them. But there have been times where if I'm dealing with someone that I just really want to tell off, in a professional way, I will sometimes compose an email with the idea that I will never send it, but the act of writing it makes me feel better.
Dude, you just invited the whole world to hack your emails, so I hope I hope you have dual factor.
I'm fine. I'm good.
Yeah. So anyway, the Mattis letter, on the one hand, it was clearly something that he had pondered for a long time. On the other hand, it was written in a huge hurry. As a colleague of mine who's a PR professional pointed out, there's punctuation errors, there's missing articles, there's inconsistencies. I mean, I don't know that anyone in the world still works this way, but I kind of imagine Mattis sitting there and dictating it to someone.
Well, the best part, you want to talk about, Mattis being old school. My favorite detail of all this was that apparently after he resigned, he went back to the Pentagon and then ordered apparently that 50 hard copies of the letter be distributed to the Pentagon, which is the largest building in the world. And last I heard has email.
That's a nice, but actually I think those copies are going to be valuable sort of souvenirs of this era. So you could think of it as he was ensuring
he was creating relics.
he was creating. Yeah, there you go. It's very, very medieval. I like that. I mean, that's really old school.
Yeah, but I agree with you that it was interesting. I mean, even in Twitter in real time, as the letter came out, it was striking to me that the foreign policy people read this and immediately understood what Mattis was trying to say, even though, as you say, I agree that there was the occasional piece of sloppiness in the letter, whereas the professional writers and editors were all like, I don't know, what is he really trying to say here? It's not clear to me. But I suspect you're correct that clearly he'd been thinking about it for quite some time, but only pulled the trigger, yesterday. Although my understanding is he had the letter with him when he went to the White House to talk to Trump in the afternoon.
There was a great piece of gossip going around the Pentagon press corps earlier in the week, which I had totally discounted, which shows you what I know, that Mattis was so fed up with Trump that if Trump didn't go visit the troops over Christmas, Mattis was going to quit, which I thought, well, nobody thinks Trump is going to go visit the troops over Christmas. So if that's true, then that's Mattis winding everybody up that he's going to quit. So,
although what's striking to me is that even last month, I remember talking to someone within Mattis's office who made it clear to me that Mattis was staying until the end. Yes. That he viewed himself. What is striking is even in the last 6 weeks, I would say, the transformation, because even 6 weeks ago, and there have been reports about Mattis losing influence and Trump being alienated from Mattis for a year now at least. But as recently as 6 weeks ago, people who are high ranking in his office told me, look, he sees this job as, he's the bulwark against the president doing something, slightly crazy, and therefore he's going to stay as long as humanly possible. It is telling that 6 weeks later, that's apparently the as long as humanly possible part.
So, Dan, you are reminding me of a major strategic theme and overarching question, which was occupying my mind less than 24 hours ago, which is the question of why the president felt it necessary to make these moves on Syria and Afghanistan right now. And I was really struck before Mattis yesterday. The moment that most struck me was Ed Luce of the Financial Times writing a tweet, and Frank Fukuyama of End of History and other light novels fame retweeting it, saying basically the only reason this plus the lifting of Treasury of sanctions on several large Russian companies this week can be happening has to be a sort of Trump outreach to Moscow, given what's going on the political side. And I really looked at that and I thought, I've worked so hard for 2 years sort of to really err on the opposite side of conspiracy theorying everything back to Russia. And in part, I do that. I do that because just generally, I think people mostly are not competent enough to carry out big conspiracy theories.
Right. Always favoring competence over malevolence. That's my.
Yes, but also let's just be honest, because subscribing to conspiracy theories is a really quick way to get yourself thrown out of the foreign policy establishment.
Yes.
So I do, in order to sort of guard my status, I zealously stay away from it. And so I looked at this and I was like, well, if Ed Luce and Frank Fukuyama are all in on this now, does that mean we're all conspiracy theorists now? How do we? Why the hell? Why was it so important to do Syria right this week? Why is it so important to announce cutting the troops in half in Afghanistan by the end of the year? There's really it's not like you're going to take those 10,000 troops between the two places and send them straight to the southern border. Why would you do that?
Okay, so I would say two things on this. The first is on the conspiracy theory part, and I've said this before, the worst aspect of this administration by far is that as someone who's been an avowed sort of, rejection of conspiracy theories that go all the way back to the 2000 election. I think that's the first time I remember, these things mushrooming in terms of our political conversation. I can't reject these. I don't think your argument is. I don't think the Ed Luce Frank Fukuyama argument is correct. If the preponderance of evidence to me suggests no, this is not the case. But on the other hand, who the hell knows at this point? 2 years ago. No, not 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, the idea that this, if I told you all the things that have actually come to light, it would have been preposterous. That said, I still have my doubts, actually, that Trump is doing these things because he is somehow in Putin's pocket. I tend to think there are two other explanations that are a little more, I think, have more validity. Well, three. One is, to be fair to Trump, he has wanted to get troops out for a long time. So this is not something new. He's talked about, he was rolled by his advisors on Afghanistan in 2017. And that, in some ways, that was the sort of big meeting that defines the sort of cleavages within the administration, where they had the meeting in the tank in the Pentagon where, essentially Cohn and Mattis and the rest of them all said, look, this is why we should do all these things. And Trump is like, no, we're getting screwed over. And he also got rolled on Syria earlier this year. And, he's the president of the United States. And there are times where I think if he continues to get rolled on this stuff, he eventually lashes out. And he lashes out in, unpredictable ways. So that's thing one. Thing two is that, he clearly does somehow believe that some accommodation could be had with Putin. Although, truthfully, at this point, you have to wonder, even if he were actually in control of the executive branch, if the Russians would buy any of this, because, the degree of volatility in U.S. foreign policy has been all over the map. I think the real reason he did this, there was an Associated Press report that said that the conversation with Erdogan last week was what sort of triggered it. But I think the deeper reason, and I've argued this week, is that essentially Donald Trump, as the head of the executive branch, has run into the very hard limits of what he can do. Yeah. And so this entire month has been an exercise in what Trump can't do. He can't browbeat the Fed into listening to him. He can't get, funding for the wall from Congress, although he's, going to try his damnedest on that, but I don't think it's going to happen. He's facing a 2019 where he's going to be hemmed in by a Democratic House. Oh, and by the way, the courts have started to come in and blow apart some of his conspiracy theories about, let's say, Michael Flynn, and also some of his immigration orders. So I think this is a situation where foreign policy remains in some ways the last refuge for a president who is hamstrung by other institutions in the in the federal government. And this is the one area where he still can do stuff.
Yeah, I've been really fascinated. Quite a bit of the coverage of it has emphasized his feelings about keeping his campaign promises. And, how can I put this? I'm a person of a certain cynicism, as viewers know. And I don't often associate a touching literalness about keeping one's campaign promises with American politics. But it does, I think. So reporters have said that enough times that there's clearly something in how Trump and his close cohort have been talking about it off the record. And I do also then think there's kind of the piece of what is the thing that I can give to my base that shows I am still Donald from the block, keeping it real.
Although this is where, two things on this. The first, I think you're correct on the political side of things, which is, this is where, again, it's not exactly a conspiracy theory, but you can argue that if Donald Trump is trying to maintain his survival and is legitimately fearing impeachment and potentially removal from office, he needs 37 Republican senators to vote in lockstep with him, no matter what evidence comes to light. And the strategy he's pursued on this for the past 2 years has been to appease his base. So, this is why I think he's doing stuff on the wall. The interesting question, and this is finally, we can talk about it a little bit more in terms of foreign policy, is I don't know whether Syria and Afghanistan, his moves there, appease his base. I don't know. This is where things, honestly, I think get legitimately complicated. Now, we've seen this sort of discourse where there is no doubt the sort of Rand Paul wing of Republicans and a similar mirror, group on the left that I think, is actually really happy about these decisions on Syria and Afghanistan, even while they acknowledge that the process has been screwed up. They think the U.S. has too large a military footprint elsewhere. They want U.S. troops to come home. They're perfectly happy about that. But there is also the sort of neoconservative, or Jacksonian wing, however you want to put it, the sort of Tom Cotton, Lindsey Graham of the world that clearly are viscerally opposed to this. And think it's a serious mistake. And I have to admit, this is where the cynic in me thinks none of this matters with respect to on foreign policy to his base. I don't think his base cares one way or the other about Syria or Afghanistan, because I don't think it rises to the same level that the wall or, immigration or, the sort of other identity issues that Trump likes to play, likes to engage in matter. in the same way.
Well, if I were him, I would say a win is a win is a win.
Right.
The other thing that is fascinating about this is that two of the people who in the past have been presumed, at least two and maybe more that I have missed in the insanity, at least two of the men who were presumed to be top contenders to replace Mattis were out very publicly opposing the Syria and Afghanistan moves, which is to say Cotton and general commentator Jack Keane. So
can I ask you what? So you're in DC. I'm far removed from it, or so you might have the skinny on this. And this is an insane question. I'm actually surprised there hasn't been more speculation on this. Is it possible that Trump names Rand Paul Secretary of Defense?
Why would Trump do that?
The reason I say that is that if the way Trump is tacking right now, it is consistent with what Rand Paul believes in. Rand Paul as a senator would presumably have a slightly easier segue through or confirmation process. And also, and I mean this seriously, who the hell else is going to take the job at this point?
Well, so the thing is, Rand Paul is not particularly well liked by his peers.
Yes, that's true.
But I mean, it has been, how can I put this? It has been demonstrated before that members of Congress will very happily confirm a colleague they don't like to a job elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And it is certainly true that Paul's seat is one of the ones that you have less risk of losing to a Democrat. But I can't believe that Trump would really get along with him very well either, honestly.
Well, Trump's not going to get along with anyone. I mean, this is, already there's been reports in the press that he's ticked off at Mick Mulvaney because the video surfaced of Mulvaney saying that Trump is a terrible human being. And it's possible, by the way, I don't mean to be specific to Paul. I guess my honest question is that given the way that Mattis stepped down, who on the Republican side of things is going to agree to be the Secretary of Defense?
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because just literally as I was running around to tape this episode, one of my New America colleagues stopped me and said, "What's this I hear about David Petraeus being interested in the job?"
Oh, God, no. Oh, my. Sorry. I hadn't heard that one. Okay. Keep going.
I don't know the truth of this rumor. But I think you can use Petraeus as a stand-in for a certain class of individuals whose ambitions run very, very deep.
That is fair. But there's a separate category, which I think also fits into this, which is I think the only pool that Trump is going to be able to dip into on this is going to be that meets the necessary qualifications for, if you exclude everything, like absent everything else, I suppose Petraeus as Secretary of Defense is not the worst choice. But he's only going to be able to pick people who, I mean, in some ways it's the John Bolton thing. He only will be able to pick people who would not get hired in another administration, Republican or Democrat.
Well, there's also the current deputy, who came to the Pentagon from Boeing and had a very easy confirmation. So, is probably not going to refuse to be elevated.
True, although the confirmation here. So, I mean, again, this is one of these things where I don't know if Trump realizes the problems he creates, which is, the confirmation hearing on whoever is picked is going to be just fun as all get out.
Well, this gets us to kind of the interesting question about where we are now. That on the one hand, the trio of announcements, created a depth of panic among the sort of DC establishment that you really haven't seen since the very beginning.
Right, since November 2016, yeah.
Yeah. And so all the people who've sort of been saying all the way along, this is okay, the grown-ups in the room, it's all worth it for the judges and the tax cuts, this is the democratic process, Trump is a blip in the pan. There's those people were sort of the ones creating a disturbance in the force around here last night. So there's sort of two directions that could go, I think. One is, and you saw a number of people sort of saying, oh, this is the beginning of the end, this is what's going to push Republicans to support, either removal for competence or impeachment. But the other way that goes is, no, we just have to put someone in there that can manage things. And so I actually think you could see, and again, because the new Senate is more Republican, you could see a relatively easy confirmation process where, Republicans ask questions like, you can walk taking one step at a time, and you're familiar with the basic tenets of how the military works, right? And Democrats try to ask really hostile questions and get facts out there, but it's just perceived as totally partisan. So, maybe it would be great if this were a turning point. The other point being there are 5 cabinet vacancies right now.
God, are we at 5?
Well, it was interesting. Yeah.
Attorney General, Interior, DOD,
UN, and EPA.
Oh, that's right. Although UN will probably no longer be a cabinet agency, but point taken.
Right. So I'm not sure that you see a really and another sort of thing that people probably missed because there was so much else going on. But Lindsey Graham is getting off Senate Armed Services.
Oh.
So you'll have new, more junior senators, not necessarily senators who are big critics of the president. So one might be surprised about a confirmation hearing is all I'm saying.
No, that's certainly a fair point. We should step back for a second. Speaking of which, of the 5 cabinet officials, you wanted to talk about more than Mattis today. So the other things that happened, I believe, this week, honestly, I can't remember.
Right. So we've mentioned troop withdrawals from Syria and Afghanistan. And I can't stress enough that whether you are somebody who thinks we should be doing a lot more in those places or whether you're somebody who thinks we shouldn't be doing anything, it's total freaking incompetence and appalling. So number one, we didn't warn the European, we didn't warn the Russians. Putin went out for his year-end news conference yesterday and he said, well, about this withdrawal, I don't know. The Americans say they're withdrawing from Afghanistan every other year. And, check, he owned us.
Yeah.
Nobody knew this was coming. There's just one town where there are 50,000 internal refugees living under protection of the U.S. troops that are there. 50,000 people that we just were like, So if you're a person who thinks that there should be fewer troops in Syria because killing people is bad, you kind of got to think to yourself, well, does this really result in less killing of people? So it's just appalling, and I don't care what your position is on it. So wanted to say that. The others, we mentioned the Treasury announcement of a plan to desanction 3 Russian companies that were controlled by a particular oligarch, but not just any oligarch, the one that used to be really close to Paul Manafort. And so although he's not supposed to be in control of any of the companies anymore, he still gets to own 45% of them. And then his ex-in-laws own 7% of them. And a foundation that he founded gets to own it. So people looked at this and said, not really sure what to think about this.
And I believe they're all going to be in Davos at the same time. I'm not kidding. I believe that Drezburt is going to be there at the same time that Trump is bringing. That's the other weird thing that happened this week is during Sarah Sanders' press conference. I mean, I believe something like 6 or 7 Trump administration cabinet, the remaining cabinet. Actually, I wonder if Mattis was in that group. But 6 or 7 of them are heading over to Davos next month.
I had totally missed that, Dan. Thank you.
Yes. Just as I had. I mean, this is where I start this is where you do start getting more conspiracy minded in terms of why the hell are you lifting these sanctions? And more importantly, for a president who supposedly believes in using leverage on anything, what leverage what did he get from this if this decision was made? And I don't know.
You are reminding me just while we're reviewing other things that happened this week that people should be really concerned about. That crazy story that the Treasury Department, I believe it was, going back to 2016, appears to have been penetrated by Russian agents that were seeking confidential data on a range of American nonprofits, including Jewish organizations that I looked at, and I didn't immediately understand what Moscow wanted there, but just a very, and this is not one you can blame on Trump, but just
right. We should be clear about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, this is a story. This is a story, frankly, of dysfunction in the Treasury Department, where there appear to be multiple things going on. The first is that a policy office in the Office of Terrorism and Terrorist Financing essentially got played by the Russians, trying to engage in cooperation to shut down ISIS, but wound up agreeing to do things like use, Gmail or Hotmail accounts to correspond with the Russians, which makes no frigging sense to me whatsoever. And as someone who used to work at Treasury, that would even 15 years ago, that would have sent up flares in terms of why would I want to do that. But then related to this is the notion that FinCEN, which is the U.S. financial intelligence unit, which is supposed to do things like combat money laundering and help combat terrorist financing and help, to some extent in the ability to engage in targeted sanctions, that unit seems to be falling apart slightly under leadership, which again appointed prior to, I believe, Trump coming into office, or maybe just when he started. But I don't want to put this on Mnuchin and Trump. It seems like there were problems going in, but they have certainly festered since then, to the point where there was an attack in London, the terrorist attack in London, when there was a drive. I think there was the drive
near Parliament. Yeah,
right. That FinCEN immediately dashed in to try to get access to records to see if they could figure out who the heck this was, and found that they were locked out. Because a rival office had somehow, locked them out of this sort of database. So this is, in some ways, this is the perfect storm of simultaneously the deep state sort of, going slightly awry, and yet, of course, the Trump administration not being able to manage any of this. So it's just festering and getting worse.
Yeah. So I want to come back to this theme about institutional weakness, sort of at the very end, where we ask if we learned anything from this year. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that while you were drinking.
That's okay.
But just a couple of other sort of little news blips from the week that would have been huge stories in any normal cycle. But I believe some steps forward were taken on setting up an alternate payment clearance center in Switzerland for Europeans for their work around the Iran sanctions. Did I somewhere in the vague back of my mind, did I see that?
So I'm going to come clean here and say that all I've been doing this week is grading when not paying attention to, the Trump stuff. So I will need to look at this. If that happened, it's not good, at least from the U.S. perspective of, preserving the dollar as the global reserve currency. And but nonetheless, this is, by the way, something I warned would happen, I believe, last month.
If it happened, I warned it would happen.
If it happened, I said so. If it didn't, well, at least I was prudent and cautious.
The other thing that happened yesterday, while we were all kind of freaking out and otherwise occupied, but I believe that the North Koreans made explicit something that was totally clear if you had been paying any attention, but nonetheless, it was helpful of them to make explicit, which was they're not denuclearizing unless we go first.
Yes, which, is a polite way of saying that whatever you thought was agreed to with Singapore, and it was not obvious that anything had actually practically been agreed on, it's now dissolved. And this, by the way, brings us back to the sort of personnel thing, which is the degree to which, someone on Twitter, I think, referred to Mike Pompeo as not the Secretary of State, but rather the Secretary of Iran and North Korea. I think it might have been Tom Wright who said this, our colleague at Brookings. And, it is safe to say that neither of those, portfolios is going terribly well at the moment, in the sense that if you're an Iran hawk, getting U.S. troops out of Syria does not strike me as your immediate preferred go-to move.
Well, I'm going to stop you there because we're going to be even a little more specific. And this refers to some people, Dan, that you and I both know personally. But the senior Iran team at the State Department indeed has spent all of recent weeks going around Washington explaining its strategy to step up its game against Iran in Syria. Literally, that was a core plank of what the State Department's Iran strike force, Iran task force,
they'll rename it Strike Force now. You realize
that it was doing, and so of the people, sort of Mattis went out on a pyre of glory, but there are several, the senior state Iran envoys, the senior state Syria envoys who are limping around Washington with bad burns right now, let's just say. But I cut you off before you mentioned North Korea, which is also, as you say, glorious.
Right. But in some ways, North Korea is playing out exactly as you said. And so, one wonders exactly what Mike Pompeo is in some ways. I think Mattis's choice to step down is interesting because Pompeo has clearly made a different choice, despite the fact that on Iran, he's at least gotten partially rolled. And, I know for a fact that let's just say the North Korea negotiations are not going. He stuck his neck out a fair amount to sort of try to implement Trump's, vision on this. And I would say that's not going out, going terribly well either. And to be fair, that's not entirely Pompeo's fault. I don't mean to suggest that, like, if he had been a better diplomat, he somehow could have pulled this off. But that's not going to carry any water with Trump either. And I'm sure Trump is going to be displeased with him.
Yeah. And this may be the point where we start transitioning into trying to make sense of the year, unless there's anything else that's happened in the last week that I've forgotten. But, when I had to write about Mattis very quickly last night for New York Magazine. And one of the things that I think all of these guys kind of misunderestimated was the idea that you can serve Trump but not be changed by him. And, Pompeo, who is a difficult personality, who I don't have a lot of sympathy for, but they did a really good job of pulling together a way to save the Iran deal. And then Trump cut their legs out from under them. And Pompeo is continually humiliated by the North Koreans, who seem to take particular delight in putting him in these appalling circumstances that he would never stand for otherwise.
Right. No, and just to interrupt, one of the more fascinating aspects of this, and I confess this is schadenfreude, and I should probably not feel like this, but is watching people like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo serving this president, doing things that if it was any other president, they would be on Fox News kicking and screaming about the fact that it's being done. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so kind of my first takeaway from the year is you don't change Trump, Trump changes you. And as fun as it is to have schadenfreude about the people around him, it goes for all of us too. And it goes for our institutions. And so I kind of end the year, feeling, as worried as I ever have, but also really wanting to keep pointing out to people that the problem is not just Trump the individual, it's also institutions that were weak or neglected or past their prime. And, one thing I'm hopeful of about the last few days is that our many friends who like to say, and I have to say I heard this at Christmas parties around town earlier in the week, oh, Trump is a blip, he's a flash in the pan, he's one guy, we can fix all of this afterwards. The problem is much deeper than that. And if you hadn't understood that before, you really need to understand it now.
Yeah, so if I were to take back and think about 2018, in terms of foreign policy, or even just the Trump administration more generally, I found that I proceed on two tracks. One track is just to be appalled by, what's actually being done in some cases where, whether it's immigration or trade or a variety of other measures where I don't think, the North Korea outreach, that happened. The summit happened this year, right? I'm not crazy on that. Yeah, it did happen this year, earlier this year, where even the things that looked kind of okay, or like you could have had a positive spin on it at the outset, now look pretty bad. And it's pretty appalling. And then there's the second track where I can't stop laughing. Because there's a degree to which this is almost comical. And this might be where maybe I'm a little different from you on this, which is I have a little more faith in the robustness of these institutions going forward. And it's not that I agree with you that they've been, congressional oversight over foreign policy has been eroded, has eroded very badly. And again, this has nothing to do with Trump. This preceded Trump. But there are ways in which I would argue that Trump has almost forced antibodies to emerge in places that would not necessarily where they otherwise would have been dormant. where you even have people like, let's say, Chuck Grassley suggesting, you know what, I think we need to consider whether or not these national security exemptions that Trump has used to impose tariffs will necessarily be the brightest idea. And the fact that the courts and so on and so forth are also, putting at least some limits on the presidency, in no small part because Trump is constantly pushing those limits. So in some ways, there was almost guaranteed to be pushback. The part where I am concerned about is the part where he has fewer, checks and balances, which is control of the executive branch, and the degree to which the damage he is doing both to the sort of foreign policy / national security bureaucracy is going to be more lasting. And in the sense of, people leaving the State Department in droves, and people probably now, going to be leaving the Defense Department in droves following Mattis's departure. And, those are skilled people that you can't hire back because, that they're not going to come back. And so it's a loss of expertise that I find disconcerting. And I think the other way, I think the more disturbing thing is, presidents very often get frustrated about the fact that they have to deal with or clean up the messes of their predecessors. Obama didn't want to deal with Iraq when he came in, or Afghanistan when he came in as well. But he obviously had to deal with those things because Bush, by invading, created the problem for his predecessors. And Trump is in many ways the same way in terms of, a whole variety of policies, not just in, Afghanistan and Syria, but also things like, think about this first call with the Prime Minister of Australia, where he realized he had to take migrants and, and so on and so forth. Trump is now actually creating a legacy that his successors are going to have to deal with. Sorry, I think I said predecessors when I meant successors before. But he's going to have to deal with he's creating a problem that his successors are going to have a problem coping with, which is essentially, what is the value of U.S. credible commitments? Or rather, what is the value of U.S. commitments, and are they still credible? Because Trump, in many ways, is not violating the law by pulling out of the Paris Climate Change Accords or by pulling U.S. forces out of Syria or what have you. He's fully within his rights as president of the United States. Even withdrawing from the Universal Postal Union, most international agreements have exit clauses. We just haven't really thought about them until this president. And so my concern is that even in a post-Trump world, will anyone believe if the United States signs something that we will actually stick to it?
Well, I was going to say something perhaps similar, which is that antibodies are great for destruction. And antibodies are not designed for building or renovating things. So I think that's a great image. I think 2019 is going to be the year of the antibody, but I think that is likely to bring with it more destruction than reconstruction. And I'm sorry to viewers that the ghost of Christmas Future is calling me on my other line. So that's my prediction for 2019. And in straining to end on a positive note, I'm trying to think about how many days it is to pitchers and catchers.
Oh, God, it's got to be probably 60 or like a little more than 60.
God, that's a long time.
I'm sorry.
Within which we also have to, see what happens to the successor agreement to NAFTA, get through a budget process, a State of the Union, a NATO ministerial successors for Mattis and Nikki Haley. What else have we got coming up in the first 60 days of the new year?
There's the Davos, there's the World Economic Forum.
Davos, right?
There'll be the Munich Security Conference.
Creation of Bolsonaro in Brazil.
Yes. And wait, has AMLO been? That happened December 1st. Yes, he's already been put in. The possible, further protests in France and Hungary and Brexit. Yeah, that. How could we have forgotten that? Right.
And by the way, the fact that Theresa who the hell would have predicted a year ago that Theresa May would outlast Jim Mattis? So, man, that's my other lesson of 2018, man. It is good to be underestimated.
I suppose so. And with that,
you guys you're going to need us in 2019. Come back and see us.
I like your positivity that we're going to be around to talk about it, so that's good.
Oh no, we're not going to be released from this anytime too soon.
And to close, this is the bad place.
Yes. Happy New Year, Blocking Heads viewers, and thank you for your patience with our sort of rare and peripatetic appearances. But this was so much fun. We'll definitely do it again soon.
Yes, and have a good year, Heather.
Thanks. You too, Dan.